Chapter 7 The Potentials of the Soul. It seems to you that you have only one form, the physical one that you perceive, and no other. It also seems that your form can only be in one place at one time. You have indeed other forms that you do not perceive, and you also create various kinds of forms for various purposes, although you do not perceive these physically either. Your main sense of identity is involved with your physical body, so that it is, for example, extremely difficult for you to imagine yourself without it, or outside it, or in any way disconnected from it. Form is the result of concentrated energy, the pattern for it caused by vividly directed emotional or psychic idea images. The intensity is all important. If you have, for example, a highly vivid desire to be somewhere else, then without realizing it consciously, a pseudo-physical form identical with your own may appear in that very spot. The desire will carry the imprint of your personality and image, even though you remain unaware of the image or its appearance in the other location. Though this thought image usually is not seen by others, it is quite possible that in the future scientific instruments may perceive it. As it is, such an image may be perceived by those who have developed use of the inner senses. Any intense mental act, thought, or emotion will not only be constructed in some physical or pseudo-physical manner, but will also bear to some extent the imprint of the personality who originally conceived it. There are many such incipient or latent forms. To help you imagine what I am speaking of, you might think of them as ghost images or shadow images, though this is only for the sake of analogy. Forms, for example, just beneath that have not emerged completely into physical reality as you know it, but are nevertheless vivid enough to be constructed. You would think them quite real indeed if you could see them. Each individual actually sends such replica images of himself out frequently, though the degree of materialization may differ, some forms, for example, being more or less shadowy than others. However, these forms are not mere projections, quote-unquote flat images. They have a definite effect upon the atmosphere. They make room for themselves in ways that are rather difficult to explain, although they may coexist at times with physical objects or shapes, or may even be superimposed upon these. In this case, there is a definite interaction, an interchange that is, again, beneath physical perception. You may suddenly strongly wish that you were standing by a beloved but distant familiar seashore, for example. This intense desire would then act something like a core of energy projected outward from your own mind, given form, your form. The place that you had envisioned would then attract the form, and it would instantaneously stand there. This happens with great frequency. It would not be seen under usual circumstances. On the other hand, if the desire were still more intense, the energy core would be greater, and a portion of your own flow of consciousness would be imparted to the form, so that for a moment you in your room might suddenly smell the salt air, or in some other way perceive the environment in which this pseudo-image stands. The extent of perception will vary here to a great degree. To begin with, your physical form is the result of great emotional focus. The fantastic energy of your psyche not only created your physical body, but maintains it. It is not one continuous thing, although to you it seems permanent enough while it lasts. It is nevertheless in a constant state of pulsation, and because of the nature of energy and its construction, the body is actually blinking off and on. Now, this is difficult to explain, and for our present purposes it is not entirely necessary that you understand the reasons for this pulsing. But even physically, you are not here as often as you are. Your emotional intensity and focus create forms besides your physical body. However, their duration and degree are dependent upon the intensity of any given emotional origin. Your space is therefore filled with incipient forms, quite vivid, but beneath the regular structure of matter that you perceive. These projections, then, actually are sent out constantly. Some more sophisticated scientific instruments than those you have now would clearly show not only the existence of these forms, but also vibrations in varying waves of intensity surrounding those objects that you do perceive. To make this clearer, look at any table in the room before you. It is physical, solid, and you perceive it easily. Now for an analogy, imagine if you can that behind the table is another just like it, but not quite as physical, and behind that other one, another, and another behind that, each one more difficult to perceive, fading into invisibility. And in front of the table is a table just like it, only a bit less physical appearing than the real table, it also having a succession of even less physical tables extending outward, and the same for each side of the table. Now, anything that appears in physical terms also exists in other terms that you do not perceive. You only perceive realities when they achieve a certain pitch, when they seem to coalesce into matter. But they actually exist, and quite validly, at other levels. There are also realities that are relatively more valid than your own in comparison. Strictly for analogy, for example, your physical table would appear as shadowy in contrast, as like those very shadowy tables we imagine. You would have a sort of super table in those terms. Yours is not a system of reality formed by the most intense concentration of energy, therefore. It is simply the one you are tuned into, part and parcel of. You perceive it simply for this reason. Other portions of yourself, therefore, of which you are not consciously aware, do inhabit what you could call a super system of reality, in which consciousness learns to handle and perceive much stronger concentrations of energy, and to construct forms of a different nature indeed. Your idea of space is then highly distorted, since space to you is simply where nothing is perceived. It is obviously filled with all kinds of phenomena that make no impression at all upon your perceptive mechanisms. Now, in various ways and on occasion, you can tune into these other realities to some degree, and you do so spasmodically, though in many cases the experience is lost because it does not register physically. Think again about this form that you sent to the ocean side. Though it was not equipped with your own physical senses, it was of itself to some extent able to perceive. You projected it unknowingly, but through quite natural laws. The form built up from intense emotional desire. The image then follows its own laws of reality, and to some extent, and to a lesser degree than you, has a consciousness. Now, you are, using an analogy again, sent out by a super-self who strongly desired existence in physical form. You are no puppet of this super-self. You will follow your own lines of development, and through means far too difficult to explain here, you add to the experience of the super-self and also then extend the nature of its reality. You also ensure your own development, and you are also able to draw upon the abilities of the super-self. Nor will you ever be swallowed by the self that in these terms seems so superior. Because you exist, you send out like projections of your own, as mentioned earlier. There is no end to the reality of consciousness, nor the means of its materialization, nor is there any end to the developments possible for each identity. Now, let's make it clear once again. Your present personality, as you think of it, is indeed indelible, and continues after death to grow and develop. I mention this again in the middle of our present discussion so that you do not feel lost or negated or insignificant. There are obviously an infinite number of gradations in the types and kinds of forms of which we have been speaking. The energy which is projected from our quote-unquote super-self, that spark of intense identity that resulted in your physical birth, that unique impetus, in the one way has many similarities to the old concept of the soul, except that it contains only a part of the story. While you continue to exist and develop as an individual, your whole self, or soul, has such vast potential that it can never be expressed fully through one personality, as somewhat explained in one previous chapter. Now, through very intense emotional focus, you can create a form and project it to another person who may then perceive it. This may be done consciously or unconsciously, and that is rather important. This discussion does not concern the so-called astral form, which is something entirely different. The physical body is the materialization of the astral form. It does not desert the body for any length of time, however, and it is not this that is projected in cases like the seaside analogy used earlier. You are presently focused not only in your physical body, but within a particular frequency of events that you interpret as time. Other historical periods exist simultaneously, in forms quite as valid, and other reincarnational selves. Again, you are simply not tuned in to those frequencies. You can know what happened in the past and have histories because according to the rules of the game that you accepted, you believe that the past, but not the future, can be perceived. You could have histories of the future in the present if the rules of the game were different. In other levels of reality, the rules of the game change. After death in your terms, you are quite free perceptively. The future appears as clearly as the past. Even this is highly complicated, however, for there is not just one past. You accept as real only certain classifications of events and ignore others. We have mentioned events. There are also probable pasts, therefore, that exist quite outside your comprehension. You choose one particular group of these and latch upon this group of events as the only possible ones, not realizing that you have selected from an infinite variety of past events. There are then obviously probable futures and probable presents. I am trying to discuss this in your terms, since basically you must understand the words past, present, and future are no more meaningful as far as true experience is concerned than are the words ego, consciousness, or unconscious.